paying any attention at all to this BP oil disaster story can tell you in pretty minute detail what's going on at the wellhead with the effort to plug the leak. And the focus on that initially, I think, made a lot of sense. Plugging the well was initially about trying to prevent an environmental disaster, trying to prevent a huge outlay of crude into the Gulf of Mexico. Ultimately, the well did not get capped, and we have had a huge outlay of crude into the Gulf of Mexico. The environmental disaster happened. Yes, there is still an engineering problem with not being able to shut off or siphon the oil at the source, but that leak is not the disaster itself. The disaster is what that leak has done. And the way we're dealing with what that leak has done, the way we're dealing with the oil that is in the Gulf now, is frankly a disgrace. At this hour, officials believe that somewhere in the neighborhood of 39 million barrels of crude have already spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. 39 million barrels. And we're acting like every new gallon is a surprise every time. Whoa, we were ready for that one. Whoa, we're ready for that one either. 39 million barrels over. I'm not doing this to tout our own show's reporting about this, but I feel like we are onto an important part of the story that is not yet sinking in. There is a major, major contrast between the Apollo project level super genius effort to try to cap the leak at the seabed, an effort that has been failing despite all of the resources and intellectual firepower thrown at it. There is a major contrast between that and the low-tech, no-tech, lackadaisical, pitiful measures being taken to deal with the spilled oil. The pathetic efforts to deal with the spilled oil and to protect the land and the shore communities and the wildlife, they are pathetic for a reason that we've been trying to shine a light on. The oil companies keep talking about how technologically advanced they are, but what they've gotten technologically advanced at is drilling deeper. They haven't gotten any more advanced on how to deal with the risks attached to that. They haven't made any technological advances in the last 30 years when it comes to stopping a leak like this when it happens. All they've gotten better at is making the risks worse by putting these leaks further out of our reach. The oil industry has made itself BP, beyond profitable, by drilling and drilling and more drilling. What they have not done, as we've learned from this disaster, is invest in any new research and technologies that can reliably stop a leak at great depth or that can reliably clean up the oil that is released in a big spill. Last week, I spoke with Dr. Mike Blum from Tulane, a professor of coastal marsh ecology. And I asked Dr. Blum why the cleanup technology is so lame, whether the industry has been investing in it at all. How much improvement has there been in the technology for when things go wrong?
Most of the investment in terms of intellectual capacity and research was made around 1979 through the late 80s. And since about the late 80s, very little work has been done. Very little research dollars have been invested in response efforts. Very little progress has been made over the last 25 years.
So as an academic, as a professor working in this field, are there endowed professorships and graduate programs that are supported by the industry to try to get the academic side of this, the intellectual side of this, sort of intellectual firepower directed toward these things, or no?
No. Certainly there are individual efforts, and there's certainly individual interest in investing in research towards remediation and recovery, but by and far it has been outpaced by the investment made in engineering and drilling technologies.
The evidence of that, of course, is on full display right now in the Gulf of Mexico, on the shores of the Gulf Coast. It's everywhere. It's still stuck to my boots. That same night that we talked to Dr. Blum, we talked to the co-chairs of President Obama's new oil spill commission. They are former Democratic Senator Bob Graham of Florida and former EPA Administrator Bill Riley. While Mr. Riley was EPA Administrator, the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened in Alaska. More recently, Mr. Riley has been on the board of an oil company, ConocoPhillips. And even he conceded to us that the oil industry, in a way, his industry, has failed in terms of developing the technology that we desperately need right now.
The extraordinary success of this industry in developing technology to go deeper and deeper into the sea, to put down a central well, and then to go out in all directions to get the product up is breathtaking. And the condition, as nearly as I can tell from looking at the photographs and the movies from what's happening in the Gulf is that the response technology is about as primitive as it was in the Exxon Valdez case. That is, the skimmers that are dysfunctional in the open ocean, the booms that break, as you say, with the slightest wave action, dispersants that are not ready for prime time, that may or may not be toxic. I would say that it's really scandalous that the response capability, even on the surface, not just the subsurface where we have admittedly a case of virtually nothing to work effectively, is really going to be a prime focus of our review, and has got to be a major priority of the Commission.
I would say it is really scandalous, he says. That from somebody who knows the oil industry from the inside. Then there's Coast Guard Admiral Thad Allen, the National Incident Commander for this disaster, the man in charge of making sure this well gets capped and that all of the oil gets cleaned up. Admiral Allen appeared on this show the very next night, and he made this point, which should now sound familiar to you.
A lot of the oil spill response technology that we are applying in this particular spill has been created over the last 20 years following the Exxon Valdez and the landmark legislation that followed that, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. I think when all this is done, we're going to have to sit down and see whether or not that technology maybe hadn't atrophied over those 20 years while the technology in deep oil drilling had moved further offshore and maybe created a bigger risk envelope. And I think that's certainly something we need to look at.
Again, I'm not here to tout this show's own reporting on this, but this point is an exclamation point that is looking for a sentence. This is a huge deal. This is the giant scandal that lurks within this disaster. The fact that the oil industry hasn't gotten around to developing any new technology whatsoever for dealing with spills. And no one made them do it. Here's the other point. While there isn't any really great technology for dealing with containment and cleanup, the technology that we do have, the really sad, sack, antiquated technology we do have, we're not even trying to do right. In BP's regional oil spill response plan for the Gulf of Mexico, remember the one that was apparently cut and pasted from their Arctic plan, the one that talks about protecting the mythical walruses of the Gulf of Mexico? In that plan, which details how they will respond to a spill in the Gulf of Mexico, BP goes on bragging and bragging about all of the offshore and shoreline protection methods they have at their disposal in the event of a spill. Methods like rapidly deploying all sorts of boom. They talk about how they'll do protection exclusion booming and containment booming and diversion booming and sorbent booming. You name the type of booming, they know all about it. They are on top of it. They will put it into practice. It'll be like clockwork. If you go to the BP Deepwater Horizon Response website, you can find all of these photos of all this pretty boom, their intent to deploy boom, the way they move boom around on land before it gets put into action. Every day, BP brags every day about how much boom they are deploying. At this hour, BP reports proudly that they have deployed more than 2.19 million feet of containment boom and more than 2.46 million feet of sorbent boom. It sounds great, right? Sounds like a huge deal. How many of those 4.6 million feet of boom look like this? Snarled up in marshes, not protecting the shoreline, blown over by tiny little wind, tiny little waves, bamboo pickets to hold the boom in place that doesn't hold the boom in place, boom that hasn't been tended to in hours, maybe days. Even this primitive technology we do have, oil booming, which can be somewhat effective if it's done right, even that isn't being done right. It needs a ton of manpower to get it in place, to keep it in place, and to remove the oil that it diverts or absorbs. None of that is happening properly. This isn't rocket science, but it is science. This could be done right, and it is not being done right. We have the capacity to do this better than we are, and we are not doing it. This would be the equivalent, post-Hurricane Katrina, of those helicopters going to take people off of roofs, and the helicopters then dropping the people they're trying to rescue. Pulling people off the roofs and then dropping them in the floodwaters. This would be the equivalent in a fire of bringing the fire trucks out and not knowing how to turn on the hoses. This would be the equivalent in an earthquake of going to search through the rubble for people, and then driving your earth-moving equipment onto half-standing buildings and smashing any people inside who may be trapped in them. Deploying boom, this most primitive technology that we've been using since long before I was born. This is being bungled. It's being screwed up. And no, this technology, this lousy technology, is not a magic bullet, but it is a bullet, and it is a bullet that is being misfired. This is a problem. This isn't meant to be, oh, woe is me, aren't we so impotent, complaining. It's true that not enough can be done to stop this disaster, but there's no reasonable human explanation why what can be done, nobody is bothering to do right. The effort to contain and clean up the oil that's already been spilled has for the most part been a failure. If you go and visit the Gulf Coast, you can see it with your own eyes. It has been a failure because the oil industry has never cared that cleanup technology stinks. They've never been made to care that cleanup technology stinks. And it is a failure because nobody is insisting that what we can do, we do correctly. The whole country has been focused on capping the still gushing well at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. And while all of the attention has been on that, the disaster onshore and at sea continues to get worse. This man-made disaster of an oil spill that was caused by carelessness and incompetence could be being eclipsed by the carelessness and incompetence that has characterized the cleanup that has followed.